We're Western. We have Western values and Western freedoms. We're the West. And we are the outpost of the West, which is furthest extended into the Middle East, he says. And they attack us not because of the Palestinian problem, not for any reason like that, only because we're Western. And so really, the terrorists, the Islamic terrorists, want to strike the West, but they can only get to us. So he says, you need to protect yourself in the West by coming over here and taking out these people who are plaguing us. So you see, in this way, and this is the same, the story, the song remains the same. He's done exactly when he came to Orlando, he spoke about Orlando, he said exactly the same thing. I'll have a slide a little bit later on. So 22 years later, after it was born in the Jerusalem Conference in 1979, the war on terror became operational with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Again, the ultimate purpose of 9/11 was to start Israel's war on terror, to make it operational, as Ehud Barak said. On September 11th, this man, Bibi Netanyahu, was interviewed by the New York Times, by James Bennett, and he was asked, how will the events of today affect Israeli-American relations? And Netanyahu said, without a heartbeat, he said, you know, it's very good. It's very good. But they said, well, it's not very good, but it'll generate immediate sympathy. Now, at that time when he made this comment, it was thought that 30,000 people were dead inside that rubble. And he's saying it's very good? How can anybody put those three words out of their mouth when there's 30,000 dead people there? But this man isn't very good at hiding his cards. He's showing his enthusiasm for this event that he knew would trigger the thing that he's been pushing for the last 22 years. His entire career was devoted to creating the war on terror, but it was sitting there like a bonfire in a thunderstorm. It wouldn't light. And suddenly, with the events of 9/11, it was lit, and it was raring to go. Then a couple years later, he spoke in a Hebrew audience at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, which is a very right-wing school in Israel. And he said, we Israelis are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. Again, he's revealing himself. He's talking about three things. The attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq are four things. But in his mind, he says that's one thing. Again, his Freudian slip. Now, it's important to understand that Netanyahu has been the chairman of the Likud since 1993. And Netanyahu, the godfather of the war on terror, is very close to Larry Silverstein, the godfather of the events of 9/11. All three towers that fell, for example, that day were Larry Silverstein's buildings under his control. And an Israeli journalist wrote in November of 2001, she said, for years, Netanyahu and Silverstein have kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was. He would always call. Their ties continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996 through 1999. This means that Bibi and Larry are very close, have regular phone sessions every Sunday afternoon for like a decade prior to 9/11. What are they talking about? Now, to understand how Larry Silverstein became the owner of the World Trade Center, it's very important to understand this was not just some straight up deal. I mean, these are the two tallest buildings in the world, and what happened was that Ronald Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder, and a very big Zionist, he was the director of Governor Pataki's privatization scheme. And he decided what would be privatized. And he called for the privatization of the World Trade Center and also Stewart Air Force Base, which became a privately owned airport. These two places, of course, played a big role in 9/11. But he was the one who decided they would privatize the World Trade Center. Then it went to Lou Eisenberg, who was the Port Authority chairman, up in the top right picture there. And Lou Eisenberg then oversaw the negotiations that delivered the building to Larry Silverstein. What did Larry Silverstein bring to the table? Larry Silverstein brought $100 million of borrowed money from GMAC. That's all he had. But and you know what he did? He jacked the rents 40% as soon as he got the building, and then insured the building for all those future rents. It's a very odd, a very peculiar, and maybe you've seen the video that's been out on YouTube now. It shows Larry Silverstein speaking at the Merkaz Habaniya, which is the center of building in Israel on a kibbutz. And he's speaking, I think it's like 2010. He's talking about the fact, he's chewing gum, He's talking about how we decided to rebuild, Building 7, the one that he owned. And he says, no, there's 2 million. We wanted 2 million feet, but we had to set up for 1.7. 1.7. He said, go ahead, let's do it. He said, so we had the first planning session of the engineers and the planners, the architects. He said the first meeting was April 2000, and the building began shortly thereafter in 2002. But between April of 2000 and 2002, the rebuilding, something big happened to his Building 7. The original building was destroyed, and he's speaking this in Israel, and he's sober. He's not medicated, and you say to yourself, well, he's talking about April. Maybe he meant April 2001. Well, that's still prior to 9/11. He doesn't mean April 2002. So he uses that in the next sentence. So here he is when he got the buildings on July 24th, 2001. This is like 5 weeks before the events. And he says, "I'm proud to assume the stewardship of the World Trade Center, one of New York's greatest jewels." And here it is, 5 weeks later, New York's greatest jewel was reduced to a pile of iron and steel and dust. And the people that removed the debris from the World Trade Center told me that all that was left was steel and dust. That's all that was left. There were no floor. There were no great amounts of concrete or anything else. That's all that was left. Now, the war on terror. The evolution of an Israeli stratagem. How did this develop? This is a little bit of Zionist history here, so bear with me. The founder of the Likud was a man named Menachem Begin. And this is a picture of him in 1948. He was born in Russia, came to Palestine in 1942, became the leader of the Irgun, and then ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. He created the Likud in 1973, became Prime Minister of Israel in 1977, which was when I lived in Israel. And when that happened, when the Likud won the election, I was living on a secular kibbutz, labor kibbutz in the Jordan Valley, and I had a girlfriend then, and she cried about this because of labor kibbutz, and she said that this is the end of Israel. This is the death of Israel. She said, today the terrorists have taken over. And I didn't know exactly what she meant, but I learned as I watched the events of 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, it was very clear who had taken over. As they invaded Lebanon in 78, and then again in 82. And when I lived in the Jordan Valley, I was a lifeguard on the kibbutz. And I would have to go out to the kibbutz sometimes, out in the swimming pool very early in the morning, because once a week we would drain the pool, and I would spray out all the algae that had grown there, and we'd refill it with water from the Jordan River. And one morning I was there, and I heard this trees like this all around the pool, and I heard this terribly loud noise. And right over my head went these F-16 fighters, just over the treetops. And they were going up to Lebanon. This is in 1978. And later in the day, I told those some of the what's it said it was terrible. I told them what I saw, and they said they're just going to Lebanon. They're going to bomb. I said I said that they could be bombing us, just to give them an idea of how that somebody was suffering under these. They said no, they wouldn't make that mistake. But the invasion of Lebanon in '78 was the beginning of this whole war on terrorism thing. This is the emblem of the Irgun, and this is the organization that was a Jabotinsky organization that was headed by Menachem Begin. And you see the emblem has this map of a much larger Israel as the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And that land now would include some of Egypt and Lebanon and obviously Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And it says in Hebrew there, Rak Kach, meaning only thus, with the gun, only by the gun will we achieve this territory that we aspire to. This Eretz Israel is basically this interpretation of biblical text to show Israel at its largest possible expanse. And the people that run the Likud are dedicated to the proposition that Israel expand to this biblical size. Here it is. Here's a picture from an Israeli website. It's called What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like. Greater Israel. From the Nile River to the Euphrates River, and in between all the land under the Rothschild star. Now, where does this come from? This has been a long strategic goal of the Israelis. Here is 1948. Israel was created in 1948 in May. This is just like 1 week after the war was over with the Arabs and the Palestinians. David Ben-Gurion spoke to his general staff, And he said, we should prepare to go over to the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. He talks about the weak point being Lebanon, and he says in Lebanon, a Christian state should be established with the southern border on the Litani River, meaning that half of Lebanon should become Israel. And then he talks about how they'll smash Jordan and Syria and Egypt, they'll just bomb everybody to smithereens. This is David Ben-Gurion. This is the first prime minister of Israel. And he's talking from a very aggressive position that Israel should smash all of its enemies, which is what it went on to do. And in 1946, Menachem Begin ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel. This was a falsified terrorism attack where the terrorists dressed like Palestinians and brought milk canisters down into the basement and blew the hotel up. It's very similar to the events of 9/11 in that was British headquarters, British military headquarters in Mandate Palestine. And the British had gone on a mission and they had rounded up a lot of information, a lot of evidence that would have hanged the leaders, the Jewish leaders of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Palestine, and implicated the evidence that the British had found implicated the head of the Jewish agency in the terrorism in Palestine. So that meant that the entire Zionist hierarchy was involved in terrorism, and that they had to destroy the building in order to destroy the evidence in order to prevent this from happening. And here's another man. This is Shimon Peres. A lot of people think that Shimon Peres is a very nice guy, but the people who know him best know otherwise. This is words of Moshe Sharett, who was the prime minister in 1955, and he's talking about the tendency that Shimon Peres has of wanting to frighten the West. And he says, Peres shares the same ideology as Pinhas Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And this is exactly what we're seeing with these terrorist attacks in America and 9/11. These are attacks that are meant to change how you feel about our position in the Middle East, what we should do. The father of terrorism. So this is a British journalist named Russell Howe asked Menachem Begin. In an interview with Begin, he said, Mr. Begin, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin said, in the Middle East? He said, in all the world. Putting on himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. He wasn't exaggerating. Here he is when he was elected in 1977. And shortly thereafter, here he is with some of his, the highest level people in the Likud party, the Likud coalition. The Likud coalition, you need to understand, was a coalition of the former terrorists in Palestine, the heads of the Jewish organizations of terrorism. Likud is composed of the leaders of the Stern Gang, or Lehi. That was Mr. Shamir, here on the right, Yitzhak Shamir. Begin was the head of the Irgun, and Tzipi Livni's father was head of operations for the Irgun. And Netanyahu's father was the head of the ideology. And then, of course, Ariel Sharon, known as the Butcher of Beirut, the man who was responsible for the massacre of Sabra and Shatila. Here's a photograph of Mr. Yitzhak Shamir. He was in power in the 80s. He was responsible for the murder of the United Nations envoy to Palestine, a man named Volker Bernadotte, who was a Swedish count, who was sent by the United Nations to try and make some way of making the partition plan work. The partition plan was a completely ridiculous idea, partitioning Palestine into these two ethnic groups, but they tried to do it, and he tried to stand up for the idea that Jerusalem would remain separate and universal, international. The Zionists didn't like that, and so they killed him Bonnie and Clyde style. They basically stopped his car on the road coming out of the airport in Jerusalem and just shot him with a machine gun. One of the people who was involved in the group at that time, this group that killed Volker Bernadotte, was the father of Rahm Emanuel. Rahm Emanuel is the mayor of Chicago. He was formerly the special advisor to Bill Clinton, and he was, of course, chief of staff for Barack Obama. He was Barack Obama's first appointed official. And Sherman Skolnick, a friend of mine, the late Sherman Skolnick in Chicago, said that this was the Mossad agent in the Clinton and Obama White House. Stands to reason. This is just a map to show you that southern part of Lebanon up to the Litani River. And as per the Zionist plan, the Litani River would be the new border of Lebanon, and the north of that would be the Christian state. and then the Muslims would be pushed either in the sea or to the further north or to the east. And that this area would become Israel. So when they invaded in 1978, they came in here, and then in 82 they came with full force, and they started setting up banks, and they wanted to take over the area, but they were pushed out by Hezbollah. But they only left this region in 2002. Now, in 1978, Israel's highest nuclear smuggling agent, a man named Arnon Milchan. He's a very high-level Israeli intelligence agent. He made his first film in England called The Medusa Touch, in which the climactic scene was a Boeing 747 crashing into the Pan Am building, as it shows here in the movie poster. The same year he made this movie, here he is speaking with Israel's defense minister, Ezra Weizmann. He is at the highest level. Arnon Milchan is at the absolute highest level of Israeli intelligence and Israeli military. Here's when they were producing the movie, they had to create this image of the plane flying into the building. This is something what I call ideation. They want to put the idea out there in the public mind that planes might be flying into buildings someday. He was quite, this was an idea that stuck to his mind. And later, he made another similar film called The Lone Gunman. This was made by Rupert Murdoch's company called New Regency Film, which is half owned by Mr. Milchan, half owned by Mr. Murdoch. And they made this as a spin-off of the X-Files. The pilot episode of The Lone Gunman was a situation where a Boeing 757, 767 passenger aircraft was on automatic pilot, and unbeknownst to the pilot, the plane had been hijacked remotely and was being flown into the World Trade Center. And only at the very last minute is the pilot able to regain control of the plane, and just avoid hitting the towers. This appeared on TV in the United States, on Fox TV, in March of 2001. Now the question is, this episode was written by Chris Carter, but where did Chris Carter get the idea of planes flying into the World Trade Center? And I suspect this is the hidden hand of Arnon Milchan talking to Chris Carter. Yeah, do one like that where the plane flies in the building. His first movie, this movie, it's too much of a coincidence. Here is Arnon Milchan in the middle. He's considered to be, I think, the second richest media mogul in Hollywood. He's worth, they say, $5.2 billion. But if you read his biography, he has a long history of being Israel's leading money launderer. He laundered money for the South African regime and for Israel. And so, where does this money really come from? Well, when we talk about the Netanyahu and the war on terror, we have to look where Netanyahu came from. He was a furniture salesman before, but in 1976 and 78, he was working for the Boston Consulting Group, which is a Rothschild-owned firm in Boston. And he left that firm, an investment-type firm. He left that firm in 1978 and went to Israel and started something called the Netanyahu Institute, named after his brother who died in the Entebbe raid in Africa. And he and his father then held a conference, planned and set up this whole conference called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism in 1979, which called for and started this big propaganda push around the world for a war on terror. It's interesting, if you look at Wikipedia and look at the war on terror, they don't mention anything about this. They say that the use of the term war on terror started with Ronald Reagan in 1984. It's earlier than that. This is the Eastern Herald of the Mossad, and in 1980 he predicted the 9/11 attacks. He was speaking to an American Zionist named Michael Evans, one of those Christian evangelist type guys, and Michael Evans asked Mr. Herald, who was the founding father of the Mossad and Shin Bet, and he was the former head of Haganah Intelligence. He asked Mr. Herald, "Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?" Herald said, "I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism," etc., etc. As to where, Herald continued, "New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power." Okay, and there are several reiterations of this same discussion that this Michael Evans had, and he put these out on a website called Jerusalem Prayer Team and his organization after 9/11, and he also spoke about these to the Israeli media. So this is well documented. Well, what happened then is Herald's Eastern Herald, the former head of the Mossad, his senior men, his highest level agents, came to America and tried to get the security contract for the Port Authority. And they succeeded in getting it. In 1987, they got the contract for the Port Authority. These two men here, Tzvi Malkin and Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor. And the thing was that somebody at the Port Authority discovered that Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor, the head of Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, was in fact a former head of Shin Bet who had murdered Palestinians and been charged for their murder. It was a hijacking of a bus, and then they captured these two Palestinians, and his agents in the field said, okay, we got these two guys, what do we do with them? And Mr. Shalom Ben-Dor said, smash their heads with rocks. So that's what they did, and it was in 1984, and that was of course, prosecuted as a crime. You can't just kill people in the field like that. And so he lost his job and came to America. But when he was discovered as being, when Port Authority discovered this, his sordid past, they tore up the contract. Had that not happened, 9/11 would have happened in the late 80s, or at least by the early 90s. And we would have been at a great disadvantage because we had no internet then. And we would be working with Time Magazine and Newsweek Magazine, comparing that to that. Huh? Basically uninformed. The internet has been the equalizer that's given us at least a fighting chance. Well, having been thwarted by the Port Authority in 1987, those two men then went to work for American, what they call Sayanim, plural Sayanim. These are American Jews who are in positions of power, have something to offer, who, when asked by Israeli intelligence or Israel to do something, they'll do it without asking questions. And so Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg, Maurice Greenberg's the head of AIG, recipient of $180 billion of U.S. federal taxpayer bailout money in 2008, 2009. These two guys work together. They have a lot of companies together. One of the companies they have together is a company called Kroll Associates. And Kroll Associates got the security contract for the World Trade Center after the first bombing in 1993. And they then maintained and kept that control. And the Port Authority said, hey, they have all kinds of wonderful ideas. They have great procedures. Everything that they told us to do, we did. So at the time, though, the Israelis had gone to work for these guys. Tzvi Malkin and Avraham Shalom Ben-Dor had gone to work for Mr. Kroll. So using the American Sayan, the American Jew, as like a Trojan horse, the Israeli got into the position they wanted to get in all along. Then in 1982, of course, there was a shooting in London, a diplomat got wounded, and Israel promptly invaded South Lebanon and went all the way to the Litani River. And then when they got up there, I was traveling with my Israeli girlfriend in America, and when this happened, and when Israel, all that stuff was happening in the summer of '82, I told her, I said, what's going to happen? Israel can't hold this land. Israel can't stay extended like that. They're going to call for Americans to go over there and hold the line. And I said, the Americans will go there and be slaughtered like pigs. That's exactly what I said. And that's exactly what happened. And that was the first time. Here we have a picture. The Americans were sent there. They didn't know what they were doing. They were put in barracks by the Beirut airport. The Israelis knew that a truck was being prepared. They knew where it was being prepared. They knew the license plate number. They knew the color. They knew the make. They knew all about it. And they did not reveal that information to the Americans. They only said that there's a chance that there will be a truck bomb coming to your men soon. But we don't know anything more than that. And the head of the Mossad, who knew all the information, said, look, America's a big power. They can take care of themselves. The fact is that the truck bomb was being created by and under the guidance of the Mossad. Just like the truck bomb that blew up in the World Trade Center in 1993. It was being constructed by and under the guidance of the FBI. This is all from the New York Times. This is not any sort of, secret information. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center was done with the guidance of the FBI. So it's not the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it's the Federal Bureau of Instigation. Because they basically instigate these crimes, trap some people into their periphery, and then blame them for the crime. Well, here's what happened in Lebanon, of course. They were slaughtered, and George Bush went over there and looked at the mess and said, these terrorists, got to do something. And what I said about the Israelis knowing that is actually from an Israeli Mossad agent, a Canadian citizen named Victor Ostrovsky. He wrote that in his books about the Mossad. So what happened then is that when you have this war on terror construct, when you've created this big war, clash of civilizations, You've got to have an enemy. And they needed to create a real anti-Western foe that they would wage war against. And the war in Afghanistan gave them that opportunity. In 1979, of course, the Red Army came into Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen began resisting. And then the American CIA and Charlie Wilson became engaged in providing weapons to these Israelis, to these Mujahideen, with the help of the Israelis. The Israelis then became basically the alpha dog. They became the ones that provided most of the weapons, because the weapons came from the battlefield of Lebanon. They had confiscated all these weapons from the Palestinians, and then they took them and sold them to the Mujahideen. And they also developed them for the... So the war in Afghanistan gave the war on terror architects the chance to create the foe, which is now ISIS, which is Al-Qaeda. How did that happen? Under Ronald Reagan and George Bush, they started to arm these Mujahideen. Here are some of these Afghan leaders in a meeting with Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office. Here's the Charlie Wilson story. And the thing is that Charlie Wilson was a very active, a very pro-Israeli congressman from Texas. And in 1973, he got elected. And when he went to Washington, he was taken under the wing of the head of the Mossad in Washington, a man named Zvi Rafia. And together, the Mossad guy and Charlie Wilson, they started arming the Mujahideen, but they chose to arm the most anti-Western group out there. They started to arm Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group and Hezb Islami. And that was a group that was extremely anti-Western. But the question is, why would the CIA and Israeli intelligence, why would they choose to arm the most virulently anti-Western group out there? And there's an author here today who's from New York. She's an English lady. And when I was in New York last March, she gave me a copy of her book called The Afghan Solution. And in her book, she has a lot of experience in Afghanistan. She writes about how the United States had a much better option prior to 9/11 and especially after 9/11 to both remove the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan without a single American soldier having to go there. This was a warlord, one of the big militia leaders. His name was Abdul Haq. He was a Pashtun, and he had great success in fighting the Russians. He had a large following in Afghanistan. He had a lot of kinship, brotherhood with the other Pashtuns, and they had a plan. He had a plan all figured out that wouldn't have cost America anything, and Afghanistan would have been put back together as an integral state with the king again, and with all the tribes coming together and agreeing that they would be, things would be better again. But that plan never went into effect. And her book raises the question, like, why? Why did the CIA not do that? And why did the CIA instead arm this Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who had no results in the battlefield, never won a battle, and he was only causing mischief and dissent among the other groups, and furthermore, he was extremely anti-Western. Why would you be supporting that guy? They did that, in my opinion, because they were creating, at that time, they wanted to create this anti-Western group that they would control, who would be the boogeyman for the next war, being the war on terror. And the evidence seems to indicate that. Charlie Wilson, he had his office in Washington, his congressional office in Washington, D.C., but the guy that used his office as his own was the head of the Mossad. This man here, Zvi Rafia. And Charlie Wilson was actually being handled by Mr. Rafia. So when Charlie Wilson would go to Israel, Zvi Rafia would take him everywhere, show him everything, and he would put him in connection with all the people that would make these connections. And in the book, Charlie Wilson's War, it says, Zvi Rafia, the station chief in Washington, the Mossad, always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of his staffers kept a list of all the people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So this is the connection between these two. And so what happened then is that in 1983, the CIA gave the money, and it was met with Saudi money, and Pakistan was like the intermediary, and the Israelis provided the weapons and the training. Israeli military intelligence trainers went over there. Now, they weren't speaking Hebrew, and they probably weren't speaking English. They were speaking Arabic, because Israel has lots and lots of Arabs from Morocco and Iraq who look and act and talk just like Iraqis or Moroccans or Egyptians. but they're not. They're Israelis. And they were working under, they were military intelligence, which means that they were working directly under Ehud Barak, who was head of military intelligence in 82, 83, 45. And then what they did is that the Americans and the Saudis got thousands of Afghan Arabs to come to Pakistan, come to Afghanistan to work for this group, Hezb Islami. And by 1984, with CIA funding and Israeli training, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar developed close ties with Osama Bin Laden. The rest is history, basically. The Israelis trained these people, armed them. Here's 1983 when Ehud Barak was head of military intelligence. He's shaking the hand of Ariel Sharon, who is now leaving office. He's been shamed by the Kahan Commission. He's been charged with personal responsibility for the Sabra and Shatila massacre. And the Kahan Commission in Israel said he should not have a portfolio again, and he should never serve in the Israeli government again. About 15 years later, he was elected prime minister. Now, here is the Mossad man. This is the triple agent that trained Osama bin Laden. His name's Ali Mohammed. He's supposedly an Egyptian military guy, but the strange thing about this Egyptian, he speaks fluent Hebrew. Now, I can tell you, having lived in the Middle East, you don't learn Hebrew in Israel, you don't learn Hebrew in Egypt, and it's hard to learn in Israel. You know, I studied some Ulpan, I studied in the kibbutz, I learned some, but it's a very difficult language just to pick up. You don't just start speaking Hebrew, just listening to records. And so this man, he is like the red thread that runs throughout Al Qaeda. If you read about Al Qaeda operations, the bombing of the embassies in Africa, or the bombing of the USS Kroll, or any of the terror attacks that Al Qaeda committed in the 1990s, you always find this guy involved at the highest level of that crime. So he was then taken into custody, and he was charged in the United States with terrorism for being responsible for blowing up the African embassies. He was charged with life in prison, and then he just disappeared from the system. He disappeared entirely from the penitentiary, from the system, and he's gone. He's just gone, disappeared, vaporized. And this is the man that trained Osama bin Laden. He trained al-Zawahiri. These are these two men here. This is the Al-Qaeda that we came to love and know, right? And these are the guys that were trained by the Israelis, funded and trained by the Israelis. And then what happened is that, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, this group, Hezb Islami, the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar group, sided with Saddam Hussein. And so then the Saudis kind of dissed them, stopped funding them, and then they were also divorced from Pakistan in 1994. And when that happened, the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar faction joined into Al-Qaeda, became Al-Qaeda and Taliban. And that is Al-Qaeda is what then became ISIS. So what we're seeing is that we're seeing basically a rebranding, a morphing of the same cadre of terrorists from day to day, from year to year, from place to place. So that whenever they need the United States to go and attack a place, they pull out the Al-Qaeda card. Like, oh, Al-Qaeda's in Benghazi. And then the Americans come in with all their force, and like a bull with a ring in the nose, stomp, 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 pound Libya into the dirt, and then go on to the next place. I mean, as a result of this basic policy, we've already destroyed like a half a dozen nations. Devastated half a dozen nations. We've literally bombed back to the Stone Age. Now, how did this whole idea of catastrophic terrorism affecting us, how did this become mainstream? This is how it became mainstream. These guys, Philip Zelikow, who then went on to write the 9/11 Commission report, had something called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group with Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. Ashton Carter, of course, is Secretary of Defense now. And they had this group in